under the command of General Eisenhower, began landing operations in Sicily. All Canada will be justifiably proud to know that units of the Canadian Army are a part of the Allied force engaged in this attack.
I'm David Halton, and that was how my father's generation landed in Europe 30 years ago on July 10th, 1943. 5 months later, on Christmas Day, they were in the small Adriatic city of Ortona, fighting one of the bloodiest street battles of the Second World War. In June of '44, they were in the hills east of Rome, and 6 months after that, on the northern outskirts of Ravenna, almost an entire nation away from that first bridgehead at Pacino. This past summer, our cameras traced back part of that route, seeking out some of the old roads where the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 5th Armored passed through the Apennines and out onto the Lombardy Plains. As we went, we recorded some of the contemporary scenes along the Autostrada, the great new superhighway that run parallel to the roads of history and which form such a vital part of modern Italy.
Pacino, an ancient town at the southern tip of Sicily, across from the battlefields of North Africa, where Montgomery's 8th Army had just completed the conquest of Rommel's Africa Corps. The landings at Pacino Beach were uncontested, the enemy forces having retreated into the hills beyond the town, where the Green Canadian troops would soon come under fire. There had been initial reports from the beachhead, and there would now be a series of almost daily commentaries by a new figure on the military scene, the broadcaster as war correspondent. The Italian campaign was covered fully by the CBC, and the first reports were sent by correspondent Peter Stursberg.
I was the first Canadian radio reporter to cover the troops in action. There were just 2 of us, the Canadian press reporter and myself with the CBC, who landed with the 1st Division in Sicily. Now, you've got to remember that this war was the first time that it was ever reported by radio. For the first time, the sound of battle was brought into the living rooms of the Canadian people. The crash of guns, the crash of bombs was heard in their own living room. And radio, in many ways, is much more intimate than television is. And that is why this was a tremendous event as far as the Canadian people were concerned.
These were the men of the 1st Division, many of whom had been away from Canada for more than 3 years on seemingly endless maneuvers in England. The first advance into the countryside was easy enough, with the initial problems limited to heat, uncertain drinking water, and the occasional scorpion. But at least they were part of the action now, the central action of their times, moving north into the high hills of eastern Sicily, still waiting for their first clean shot at a veteran enemy. Grain ripening in the fields made many a prairie boy homesick, but there was comfort in the knowledge, as there often would be in the next year and a half, that the U.S. 5th Army was out there to the west, and veterans of the British 8th Army were advancing on the right. Historians of the large-scale war described the action at Grand Michele as a minor skirmish. Minor it may have been, but it was also murderous, and men died in flaming tanks along these now pleasant streets. The enemy on that day was a veteran unit of the Africa Corps, and they were well entrenched with a sophisticated battle plan. But in the end, it was the enemy who fell back, unnerved by what he felt to be undue recklessness. The Canadians didn't fight according to the text because they still didn't know the text. But they learned fast enough in their first encounter here at Grammikelly.
Stasera siamo qua. Stasera ce ne siamo troppi qua. Dottore, mi dia qua un quarto di chilo di gelati, 10.
What the Italian campaign was about on a grander scale was the concern of the generals, and as far as the 1st Division was concerned, one general in particular. Major General Chris Vaux, still hale and hearty at the age of 70, a graduate of RMC and a career soldier from that time on. He recalls the general strategy governing the campaign in Italy.
Originally, the conquest of Sicily was merely to make secure the Mediterranean for our shipping, as part and parcel of a continuation of the North African policy. The decision to go beyond the conquest of Sicily was taken by the heads of state at this Trident Conference in Washington in May 1943. It was then decided, as I previously mentioned, to carry out such operations against the mainland as would knock Italy out of the war and would also contain as many German divisions as possible in Italy. But the whole essence of the business was that all resources, all manpower resources, and there are maximum manpower resources, and a maximum of material resources should be put into Northwest Europe in the spring of 1944. Therefore, the campaign in Sicily, even before, or in Italy, before a single British soldier or Canadian soldier stepped on the mainland, was given the role of a strategic detachment. Now, a strategic detachment is where you detach force to a distant theater to try and draw off and contain as much enemy force as possible was to hit them elsewhere. In this case, it was to draw off as many German divisions as possible from Northwest Europe, France, Normandy, and so on. Now, the campaign did achieve that purpose because at the critical period, which was June 1944, the efforts of the Allied forces in Italy, the 5th U.S. Army and the 8th British, kept 20 German divisions in Italy, and they gave them a hell of a bashing to boot.
The bashing in Sicily took only 38 days and cost the Canadians 2,227 casualties. In late August, the 1st Division faced another water crossing, this time over the Straits of Messina to the mainland of Italy.
The Canadians crossed into Italy on September the 3rd. And this is a crossing, or a landing, if you like, which is almost forgotten now. Actually, it was quite a set piece. We had hundreds of guns in the hills around Messina, and I remember driving up through all the heavy traffic there was, heavy military traffic, up to Messina the night before, and staying in a villa right in the Messina area, right in the middle of all these guns, and staying up all night to listen to the and to watch the huge bombardment.
The historic straits separating the city of Messina from Reggio Calabria. Once again, the landing was virtually unopposed, with only 23 casualties on the first day. Days later, a major announcement. Italy was out of the war and wouldn't contest the advance of the Allied armies. It still left some of the toughest fighting troops in history slowly retreating into mountainous terrain to the north, waiting for a topography that they could turn into a killing ground. The war correspondents went along. So did film cameramen and several stills photographers to record the battle scenes. This picture of a weary detachment moving onward into the dawn was taken by Ottawa photographer Alex Sturton, who still has vivid memories of his time in Italy.
But during those first few days, you know, the peace hadn't been announced, and we were still at war with Italy. But I think the Italians generally had, the armed forces had known that the peace was coming, and they were very cooperative, except for some rabid Italians who worked with the Germans closely, and they would stay behind in little parties, and they created a little bit of problem too, because you had to keep a watch for them.
North again into the hills to an old Irish tune set to new words. Farewell, ye banks of Sicily.
So fare thee well, ye banks of Sicily, fare thee well, ye valleys and shores.
But generally, the Italians accepted us and greeted us and shouted. It was, you know, each village we went into was a form of liberation.
Campobasso, a serene mountain town halfway between the Mediterranean and the Adriatic. It fell to the Canadians on October 13 and was rechristened Maple Leaf City. Streets with names like Via Veneta and Via Cavour became Bloor Street, Sherbrooke Street, and the corner of Portage and Main. It was a fully equipped army that moved through here, trucks, tanks, and jeeps. But in many of the upper passes, the soldier's best friend was the mule. October was a brilliant month north of Campobasso, with the November rains and swollen river valleys still ahead, the days still sharp and cool. In North America, most mountain towns are located in the valleys. In Italy, they're perched high on the hills, built beneath a castle or mountaintop fortification. They exist by the dozen along the old mountain roads, and they all go back hundreds of years. It was in this country that word came of a new assignment for the Canadians, several river crossings away at the edge of the Adriatic. And here the fighting grew savage in what one witness, author Farley Mowat, called the Valley of the River of Blood. At the head of this gully lay the road to Ortona, a road which both sides were determined to control, and which the Canadian troops could only reach by going right up the middle, under constant crossfire from both sides of the ravine and from a farmhouse at its upper end, the Casa Berardi. A company of the Vendus under Major Paul Triquet stormed the ground in front of this building, and from these windows 15 survivors cleared a critical crossroad and opened the road to Ortona. When the men were relieved, they were out of ammunition, and Major Triquet was awarded the Victoria Cross. Ortona on the Adriatic coast of Italy, a small port city with good facilities and a training station for the merchant marine. 30 years ago, it held no particular strategic value, but somehow it was singled out by destiny to become one of the killing grounds of our time. Some unknown soul named Ortona Little Stalingrad, and the German 1st Paratroop Division set out to make that an accurate description. Behind the face of the clock in the building at the end of the street, a sniper held out for hours, and almost every dwelling was booby-trapped. Both Peter Stursberg and Matthew Halton reported from here, and some of their broadcasts are now treasured items in the archives. Here's Matt Halton's voice from Ortona 30 years ago.
The Germans were demons. The Canadians were possessed by demons. The more murderous the battle, the harder both sides fought. From window to window, from door to door, in a carnival of fury. There was something different there. Something heroic and almost superhuman. And at the same time, dark as night. This is Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from Italy.
That's Halton on the left. The battle was unrelenting, and it raged from the 20th to the 28th of December, 1943. The tactics learned in these ancient streets would later be refined into a manual of street fighting and used as a model for other engagements on the Western Front. It was not so much a battle of streets as of houses. Infantrymen moving from door to door, blasting through the walls of the next home, raking the scene with automatic fire, and moving on to the next house. It was later said of Ortona, not that it was bombed or shelled to pieces, but that it was blown down by hand. Traveling through Italy today, you find surprisingly little evidence that two great modern armies fought it out over every foot of the country. But Ortona retains a number of reminders, some of them left deliberately. Many of the buildings bear the mark of shells and machine gun fire, and one edifice has been left as it was at the end of Christmas week, 1943. This was one of the more stately homes in the early 1940s. It was gutted by shell and small arms fire and has been left as a stone skeleton with ammunition boxes still strewn about. The destruction done to some of these buildings, like the Basilica of St. Thomas, was a matter of special concern to some of the war artists. One of the most prominent of the war painters, Major William Ogilvy, recalls his reaction.
It was interesting, and it was horrible sometimes, outside of loss of human life, to see the loss of great works of art through either shelling or bombing or some act of warfare, something which you knew was irreplaceable, really, to find that it was damaged sometimes beyond repair. Fortunately, I think in the army there was a section whose particular duty it was to see that, if possible, great monuments were preserved, if it were at all possible. That is, if artillery were to come down on a building because of its nature, because it was so placed that it could be an observation post held by the enemy, then naturally the exigencies of war meant that that was probably a legitimate target. Otherwise, as much as possible, these monuments were very carefully almost rated, you might say, as to their value historically and artistically.
The Basilica of St. Thomas in Ortona was badly shelled, as shown in this painting by Charles Comfort. And another great Italian landmark was reduced virtually to rubble by both shelling and aerial bombardment. The Abbey at Monte Cassino, overlooking the entrance to the Liri Valley. In the spring of 1944, the Canadians were called over from the Adriatic sector to support the U.S. Fifth Army. The Americans had landed earlier at Salerno, just south of Naples, and at Anzio. Now there was to be a concerted push beyond the Liri Valley towards Rome. The tanks of the Canadian 5th Armored Division were heavily and successfully engaged, and it was the 1st Canadian Infantry Division which punched through the Hitler line and opened the way onto the plain. The cost in Canadian casualties, 3,713. During the course of the Second World War, some of the great cities of man were battered unmercifully. Rome was saved from that kind of destruction. By common agreement, the Eternal City was declared an open city, and after some brief skirmishes in the suburbs on June the 4th, the roads to the inner city were uncontested. It was the dream of every Canadian soldier in Italy to look upon all this, and a few made it with the advance column unofficially. One unofficial Canadian trooper remembers being at a sidewalk cafe on the morning of June the 6th and being approached by the military police and asked either to leave town or to stay indoors. The Americans, it seemed, were about to stage a triumphal march into the city, and after their landings at Salerno and Anzio, no one begrudged them that. Last summer, we talked to some Canadian travelers in Rome, and few seemed aware of that earlier time. An airline pilot and a stewardess had no knowledge that a Canadian army once stood at the gates of Rome.
I have absolutely nothing, not one iota of what happened 30 years ago. I was in diapers at the time. It doesn't mean a thing.
I wasn't here 30 years ago, and I really don't know very much at all. I've heard that there were Canadians in Rome, but that's about all.
Neither did two younger Canadians wearing a flag that didn't exist 3 decades before, but that now served them well as a visible passport. Indeed, there was some who feel that the flag itself is a product of the Second War, a reflection of the Canadian determination to retain a separate identity within the Allied armies. If the official entry into Rome failed to make major headlines in the North American press, it was because the date was significant on another front. On the beaches of Normandy, it was D-Day, the 6th of June. On June 10th, the Canadian 1st and 5th Divisions were back in their traditional Italian setting, the Adriatic. There weren't many war correspondents with them now, and fewer photographers and war artists. They had left for the Western Front. But thousands of fighting men were still in the vicinity, confronting a powerful enemy who would yield the next 100 miles a yard at a time. This is the city of Pescara, directly north of Ortona, home port for a major fishing fleet and for a certain amount of traffic across to Yugoslavia. In the 70s, the Adriatic coast is caught up in a whole new thing, a world away from the lifestyle of the 40s. The German forces retreated from this area in mid-June of '44, and in the 1970s, many of the survivors come back, bringing their children and their children's children. The older Adriatic is still visible, but the homes along the beach are something strikingly new in Italian architecture. The way of life is open and easy and extends almost the entire length of the western shore. In July and August, the Canadian forces moved through here at a somewhat slower pace. Their next assignment, the Gothic Line, a series of heavily fortified positions extending from Pesaro on the Adriatic, up the River Foglia, and across the Apennine Mountains. A tank commander from that day, Colonel Brick Brown of the Lord Strathcona Horse, remembers how it was.
Armor in the Italian campaign was used in a variety of ways. We did the classical role of the shock action of a tank. We supported infantry in the set-piece attack, and we transported them on our tanks. We were used in the artillery role, both direct and indirect. We supported infantry battalions and formations of a variety of nations. We supported the British, the Indians, and of course, formations of our own 1st Canadian Infantry Division. Invariably, the Canadians always found themselves up against the tough, ferocious German paratroop division. My own particular case, I remember a battle on Hill 253 where we were supporting a unit from Ottawa, the Princess Louise Dragoon Guards. We had decimated a group of Germans advancing across a field. We had surprised them. But to show you the tenacity of these boys, one of them would not give up, and he charged one of our leading tanks with his rifle with a bayonet fixed. We were continually faced with different weather and climatic conditions. In the summer heat, we were worried about the dust which our tanks created. We would not normally go on prepared roads, but our engineers would build us tracks. The first few tanks across these, no problem. However, after the tanks started to wheel through, great dust clouds would and our positions would be given away. The Germans knew exactly where we were. On the other hand, in the fall and the winter, we were faced with the torrential rains. Little creeks, which had only a trickle at one time, would be raging torrents the next day. The mud was unbelievable, made a real obstacle to our tanks. The Germans were past masters at using these techniques, using the natural obstacles to his best advantage. Small groups of patrols could halt an armored regiment with no problem at all.
In spite of the obstacles, the advance was steady, at the rate of a mile a day. In mid-September, the Coriano Ridge, then Rimini, and the road to Ravenna. On December 4th, the 1st Infantry Division entered Ravenna, the final Canadian headquarters of the campaign in Italy. Ravenna, just around the corner from Venice, and owing much of its style to that city. A beautiful town square overlooked by a statue of Garibaldi. The people of the city remind you that most invasions of their country have come down from the north, and that liberation has twice come from the south. Here, too, is the tomb of the Italian poet Dante. It was from Ravenna that the troops hoped to move on to the valley of the Po, and then beyond that to the Alpine passes and through to Vienna and Germany itself. At one point, that had been a much discussed strategy, but it wasn't to be. For the Canadians in Italy, their war was to end on the banks of a river just a few miles beyond the city limits. On Christmas Day, some of the troops were in the city. Others were out at the final line of battle on the river Senio. With them was Norman Depew, then a lieutenant with the Seaforth Highlanders.
I believe it was Wallace Rayburn, a correspondent for the old Toronto Telegram, who wrote a book about the war called Some of It Was Fun, and some of it was. I'm thinking about Christmas Day of 1944. And it was totally unlike Christmas Day of 1943 because there was no real fighting going on in our sector, at least. We were dug in on one side of a narrow little canal just outside a little town called Bagnacavallo, inland from Ravenna. The Germans were dug in on the other side. There were dikes, of course. We were in the Lombardy Plain. Well, early Christmas afternoon, the Jerrys, visibly intoxicated, I'll never squeal on our condition at the time, commandeered some donkeys from the local farms and started running donkey races on the dike on their side of the canal. We sat on our side and made book on who was going to win. It went on for possibly an hour until some stern senior commander became irritated that this frivolous procedure was going on. He ordered down mortar fire on the other side of the canal. The donkey races stopped, and the war, in effect, was on again on Christmas Day.
Like many of the notable rivers of history, the river Senio is an unimpressive flow of brown water. But along its banks, in the spring of 1945, two massive armies faced one another for the last time. In late March, the line extended from the Adriatic past the city of Bologna all the way to Milan. And here, for the Canadians, the firing ended, shortly to be resumed on another front.
Between July of 1943 and the summer of 1945, 92,000 Canadian troops came to Italy. Almost 6,000 of them died there and are buried in well-kept graves from Sicily to the northern marshes. The youngest of those who fought there and lived are now in their late 40s. The painters, cameramen, correspondents are in their 50s and 60s, and the generals are even older than that. But in the time between now and then, they all seem to have shared a common emotion, a desire more complex than nostalgia to return again to the soil of Italy and to walk their own particular sections of the road to Ravenna.
Many go back to visit the war graves, choice settings of special beauty in a land of beauty. The final clearing up operations around Ravenna and the Senio River cost 2,581 casualties. 600 dead are buried in the Canadian War Cemetery at Villanova and at Ravenna. The dead of Ortona are here at the Morro River Cemetery, 1,374 of them. You pass along the headstones, moved inevitably by how young many of them were. A private of the Trois-Rivières Regiment, aged 18, a gunner with the Seaforth, aged 20, 6 air crew of the RCAF, the oldest, 24. Here are a number of the men who served under Major Paul Triquet, who were with him on that day 30 years ago at the Casa Berardi, the day the Major won his Victoria Cross. Triquet himself has been back to Italy on a number of occasions to pay his respects here at the cemetery and to visit at the Casa, now restored as a working farm and run by the Berardi family. This was Madame Berardi just after the war. She was known then as the Queen of the Morro River for her work in helping to restore the shattered community. In spite of the earlier hardships, there's an obvious pride in the legend that attaches to the building and an obvious warmth towards Canadians. And of course, the war artists have a special affection for many aspects of Italy. Will Ogilvie has returned on a number of occasions, and on one of them met the woman who's now his wife. They lived together on a farm just outside Owen Sound in Ontario, in rolling hill country that has its own quiet beauty.
Right from my boyhood, I had an interest in especially the Mediterranean basin and Italy in particular because as a painter, naturally, I had always hoped to spend time in Italy for purposes of study and enjoyment. And I've been very fortunate in being able to do that. Not so very long ago, I had been rereading notebooks of Leonardo and of Michelangelo, and both were tremendously interested in the portrayal of war, and actually left very, very detailed instructions to for future generations of artists as to how war should be painted. Now, this was a very different matter from present-day warfare. To paint present-day warfare under the conditions that they experienced is a completely different matter.
For some while after the war, the paintings done by the war artists were kept at the National Gallery in Ottawa. But the custodianship is now passing to the War Museum, also in Ottawa, and in the near future, anyone visiting the national capital will be able to see these paintings and sketches and a great variety of the artifacts that are part of our Canadian military history. Archives of another kind bring back memories to the war correspondents. Peter Stursberg was still in Sicily when he first heard a German marching song and made a recording of it. He recalls the circumstance.
When we landed in Sicily, I remember hearing the peasants singing in the field a very catchy tune. And this was the famous war song, Lili Marleen. At that time, we'd heard about this song. We'd heard that in the Desert War that the British troops and the German troops used to listen to Radio Belgrade where this song was played as a lights-out tune. When the campaign was over, when the Sicilian campaign was over, and we were resting on the slopes of Mount Etna, I decided that I'd try and get a recording made of Lili Marleen. And I went down to the little Sicilian village of Ionia, and there I found a small orchestra with an Italian opera-type singer, and I think we paid the orchestra 30 shillings for doing this song. At any rate, we recorded this song with we had by that time our sound truck in there, and we were able to record the song. And then I did a little report about this song, which had become the most famous song of the war. And we sent these were all on aluminum discs, you know, and we sent it back by dispatch rider and by plane to Algiers, where it was put on the shortwave, to London, and then squirted across the Atlantic to Canada. Now, the BBC had the right to use any of the CBC material, and the BBC used my report after the 9 o'clock news. This was the feature spot on the BBC. And apparently, it was the first time that the song itself had been played on the BBC. And there were indignant letters to the Times of London saying, why was the BBC using this German song?
And there are those who've gone back seeking remembered beauty. Mountain roads at dawn, farmlands in the early autumn, small towns beside nameless rivers. They're clear enough in memory, and one thinks they'll be easy to find. But memory is deceptive, even to the photographer's eye.
I was back for a brief visit in 1960. I tried to find some of the spots where I took photographs, and I didn't have much success. I tried to remember where I was on the ground, and I'd go around the village to try and find a little road. I went in on that road, and it had rebuilt it, or my memory had failed. However, the Italian scenery was absolutely beautiful at all times, even under conditions of war. Really, basically, if you look at it, there was not a great deal of destruction in larger cities. A lot of villages were badly shelled and bombed, church steeples knocked down, any places of advantage. But the scenery behind it seemed to blend. The good times were really, age dulls a lot of memories, and I think the whole Italian theater was really a good time. It was nerve-wracking at spots. We were given ample leave, or periodical leaves to go to places like Capri or Naples or Rome. The good times were generally within the Canadian community, with soldiers on leave, our correspondents at the Brest camp. We found that working with the Canadian troops, they were always so happy, and they were also happy-go-lucky, if you want, and so considerate of other people.
This is one of the more exotic of the roads to Ravenna, a detour that not too many were able to make, but those who did will never forget. Amalfi, on the Bay of Salerno.
It's like an old lady sitting in the chair. If you like Amalfi, if you see Amalfi, it is a log like this, like a chair where a lady sitting there.
In 1943 and 4, Amalfi was the site of a rest camp 70 miles and 10 whirls away from the fighting in the mountains. British, American, and Canadian officers found no problem in coexistence here, and every once in a while, Gracie Fields would pass through on her way to or from a troop show. Not too long after the war, Miss Fields moved to a villa just off this coast on the Isle of Capri. The Canadian Rest Center was located in a cliffside hotel, a place that had been a favorite of the English in the years between the wars, and for good reason. There was no waterside swimming pool at the time and no elevator up the cliff, but there was everything else a man could dream of. The Hotel Santa Caterina, still in the hands of the same family, with many of the same staff, including the bartender.
The barman, the Antonio, he remembers very well.
And the owner, Signora Alma Gambardella.
It is a maple leaf which I had from a Canadian officer who came after the war. He remembers so well this place, the Santa Caterina Hotel. We, my husband and myself, that he brought me, he says, it is the right person to whom I must give this. And I keep it with pleasure, you know. It is like a porte-bonheur.
We asked about the number who had come back.
Oh, there are a lot, especially immediately after the war, you know. There's maybe 100, 200 persons with wife, sometimes with children, but with a lot of pleasure, really. We had a beautiful memory of them because they were so nice people. And kind, friendly, really, very nice people.
To the old-timers at the Santa Caterina, some memories of the war are more vivid than others. From the balcony of the hotel, this is one of the views, the Bay of Salerno. Here, for 3 nights in a row in September '43, the sky was lit up from dusk till dawn, as the British Navy laid down a barrage in support of British and American landings on the beach. Now, the loudest noise is the roar of trucks.
Italy as a political unit is barely more than 100 years old, roughly the same age as Canada. But the Italian culture goes back more than 2,000 years and has instilled grace into more than one age of the barbarians. Happily, the Italian genius for living exports successfully, and Canada is now reaping some of the benefits of a lifestyle that's at once flamboyant and lovely to behold.
In the years since the war, almost 500,000 Italians have left their native land and emigrated to Canada, seeking a new world for their children and bringing with them an extraordinary zest. pageantry is in their blood, and it sometimes seems that half the music in the world originated here. Without question, we've gained much from Italy in the past 3 decades, but the enrichment hasn't been all one way. When we passed through Rome last summer, there was much excitement about this musical event. It took place on the Church of St. Cecilia in the Trastevere district of the city. And there were particular plaudits for the conductor with the fine old Canadian name, Mario Bernardi. And then there's Sicily. In the western part of the island, life is still very fundamental, and the inhabitants aren't all that sure that they want the complications of modern living. But want it or not, future shock is upon them, and they're about to leap right over the industrial era into the electronic age. The roads of tomorrow are already here. Autostrada with curves graded for 100 miles an hour that sweep through the broad valleys between Palermo and Messina, pick up on the mainland and go straight to Milan without a stoplight. And if you're in a hurry, you can now cross the Straits of Messina this way. The Sicilians claim, correctly, that they reflect the very oldest of the Italian cultures, and they're proud of the evidence, such as ruins of the Teatro Greco on the edge of Syracuse.
Dans une colline, divisée en 3 parties. Nous avons la tribune, qui sont les marches, et après nous avons l'orchestre, la part de sémicile.
And this contrasting geometry on the other side of Syracuse. Recently, discussions have been taking place between the Italian government and one of the great American manufacturers of jet aircraft, and it seems likely that passenger jets will be built close to here. Fair enough, for the jet set has already discovered Sicily and one of the happier watering places of the Deep South, Taormina. Finally, you go back to the beginning of that first road to Ravenna, the road of 30 years ago, which started here at the waterfront of Piceno. It's a particularly tranquil harbor, and on the nearby landing beach, there's not a single trace of that earlier event. No posts, no wire, no crumbling fortifications. But there is memory here in the minds of those who came as invaders and were accepted as liberators.
We landed quite early in the morning. I remember when I got off the landing craft, I went into my waist in water. And the one thing that impressed me most was the heat. It was terribly, terribly hot. And I don't know, it was a very strange feeling. You got the smell of the east, which is smell of rotting vegetation, fruit, and ass dung and all the rest of it. I hadn't smelled anything like it since I was in Cairo.
We made the first sound report out of Europe. And it was the first for any broadcasting organization. The first sound report out of Europe was the Seaforth Highlanders beating a retreat in the square of this little mountaintop town of Adjira with the bells of the churches playing.
Most of us were young and gullible. And at each orders group, we were told that the next canal or the next river we would cross would be the last. And beyond that was the promised land.
Eventually, we would find out where the infantry were working. Quite often, they didn't like us around either. Some concern when we appeared because, you know, they didn't consider us as trained soldiers, which we were, and they thought that, you know, our stupidity would bring fire on them.
In wartime, the stresses were such that those things really didn't amount to very much. Man spoke a different kind of language.
Amalfi, of course. Amalfi in the hotel, of course, too.
This is the CBC television network.